Welcome to Overconfidence and the Fatal Conceit, a mini lecture on planning in progress. So this mini lecture has really been broken into two elements. The first being that we think we know how to drive. We think we know how to move an economy forward. We can actually have our hands at the steering wheel. We know how to progress things forward. This idea parallels perhaps the most celebrated overconfidence finding, Svensson's 1981 study that showed that 93% of American drivers rate themselves as better than the median. Within the overconfidence literature, this is referred to as the better than average effect. You can think about how you would rate yourself as a driver. Are you just an average driver? Most of us think we're slightly better than average. This is the idea, though, that we are knowing how to move ourselves forward. We all think we kind of know how to do it better than the average person. We know how to move things forward. We know how to get things going in a certain direction when it comes to political economy. But we had two elements, right? So we've built up this, we know how to move things forward, but we also have this second category. The second category is that we understand where we are going. We know our destination, right? We know where we're heading to on the actual map. And it turns out we're a little bit overconfident in this as well. So when we think about why do we think that we know where we're going, we can kind of parallel this to the idea that we think we understand the future more than we really actually do. When we think ahead and use foresight, we think we understand how everything will go. It turns out we're terrible predictors of the future, though. We don't really know where we or our economy is going. The first concept we can talk about on this limited ability to know where we're going is the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is the idea that predictions about how much time will be needed to complete a future task display an optimism bias, or they underestimate the time needed. For example, how long will it take me to get home from work? So if I am at the office and I'm working on things and I'm trying to just wrap up a few last minute things and my wife calls and says, "Hey, can you come home for dinner?" I say, "Oh, I'll be there in," and I give a time. I say 25 minutes, or I say an hour, whatever it is. Often these estimates are very optimistic. We often take much longer to get home than this. We can all remember being a student and thinking about how long will it take us to finish a paper, right? And we say, oh, we can write this paper fairly quickly. And then we get to writing and all of a sudden the hours and hours are going by and now it's very, very late at night because it's taking a little bit longer than we actually thought that it would. A very common example of this also is writing a book. A lot of people go forward and they're like, oh, well, I'll write a book in the next couple of years, right? So I have a book project where I'm currently on year 8 of the planned 2-year plan, and no end is anywhere near in sight, right? These kind of things happen all the time where we think we can achieve things a lot quicker than we actually can. Well, why do we have this problem? We can kind of explain this with some ideas where it turns out that we're kind of bad at statistics. We're bad with probabilities. We can tie some of that into the planning fallacy. And one particular thing that we're going to tie in with that is the idea of the conjunction fallacy, right? So this is within statistics probability, something that we're really bad at that can help us understand the planning fallacy here. So the conjunction fallacy is the overestimation of the probability of a group of events all occurring, right? So we overestimate that this and this and this and this and this will all happen, right? That's the conjunction fallacy, the overestimation of the probability of a group of events all occurring. The probability of this and this and this and this is usually a lot lower than we think. One behavioral explanation as to why this could be would be the concept of anchoring. The probability of one thing going right could be used as your anchor before guessing the statistical outcome of many of the things going right. So you're anchored to this relatively high number that gets really low really, really quickly. To showcase this, we can think about kind of the first time that this conjunction fallacy was put forward in behavioral economics by Tversky and Kahneman in 1983. In their seminal study, they presented participants with an afterwards well-known probability judgment scenario named the Linda task. So it's about a hypothetical woman named Linda, as well as a personality sketch on some of her characteristics and activities. Here is the personality profile that they gave. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. Also, as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. After reading this description, Tversky and Kahneman requested that the participants estimate the probability of a number of statements. Here are the statements that they gave to them. So we have this list of different statements. Okay. So you can go through, you could pause the video and think about what's the probability that these things are actually true. What we're going to do, though, is just focus on the last three that were on that list. What are your probability assessments that the statement here is true, given our personality description? Well, it turns out the third cannot be more probable than the first. Some versions of Linda's that are bank tellers won't be active in the feminist movement. The third can't be more probable than the first. Tversky and Kahneman first had lists where people only had one of the two of these elements in it, and showed that people on average guessed that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement to be a higher probability than just the bank teller, right? So they just put one of the first or last one given here into the experiment, and the average response was a higher probability for the last one than the first one, but they weren't seen together ever. And it should never be the case that the last one is a higher probability than the first. They didn't think it would work, but then they tried putting them both on the same list, similar to how you saw it, with the bank teller in the 6th position and the bank teller feminist in the 7th position. And most people still respond that Linda is more likely to be both than just one of the two. That cannot be true. It statistically doesn't make any sense. The most coherent stories are not necessarily the most probable, says Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We put together stories that we can understand, similar to best case scenarios, right? So we're jamming everything together and saying, does this all kind of make sense? Does it work for us? And that's how we're judging the world. The most coherent stories are not necessarily the ones that are the most probable. So we're putting these stories together so that we can understand them. They're more like best case scenarios, but does the world work that way? Well, of course not, as we can see here from another experiment.
We asked people all over the country, what's something significant that's happened to you in the last 5 years?
Bought a house.
My mom passed away.
First really serious relationship.
I graduated college.
Then we asked them what might happen in the next 5 years. The good things were put on yellow magnets, and the bad ones on blue. The results showed us something interesting. It turns out the past was a pretty even mix of good and bad, yet the future was almost all good things. Now that you've seen the results of this experiment, what does it mean to you?
We all want to think about positive stuff.
Realistically, there will be down times.
Definitely prepare myself for anything that could happen in life, not just the good things.
It's great to think optimistically, but let's plan for whatever the future might bring.
The individual in the video showing the experiment is Dan Gilbert, a behavioral economist who's done a lot of work on happiness research. He's showing that it is hard or uncomfortable to imagine all the ways that things could go wrong. It is easier to imagine the way that things could go right, and our system 1 likes ease. You could imagine the most likely story you can tell is a story where things go right, but it still only has a 5% chance of happening. Every other story, stories of chaos, randomness, and unfortunate events, could all have only a 1% chance of occurring, but there are 95 ways that that 1% could occur. The most likely story then, and the easiest thing to imagine, would still be the story of everything going right. All of this helps us understand that we have a planning fallacy, an optimism about our plans for the future. We think we can construct and obviously head into the future more easily than we can. Well, this has serious ramifications for political economy. If we think we can plan and construct and we know what we're heading towards, then we will be overly optimistic. We will have a planning fallacy towards what our economy should be or what our society should look like. Another reason we fall into this planning problem and thinking we know where we're going is hindsight bias. It's thinking that we understand the future more than we really do because we think the former future or the past future was easily understood. Let's explain this. We make the past more simple. Hindsight bias is this inclination after an event has occurred to see the event as having been more readily predictable than it was. Hindsight bias has been widely studied and well documented, including being featured in more than 800 scholarly papers. Psychologists have shown evidence for it in a number of different settings, including diagnosis by medical experts, sporting outcomes, auditing decisions, and political strategies. Your own life is probably littered with examples of hindsight bias. The high school grad who knew they would get declined by the college of their choice once they received their rejection letter. Or the person who knew it was going to rain today. The world in our rearview mirror is pretty straightforward. The idea is not just that hindsight is 20/20, that we know what happens once we're already through it. The idea is that once we get through something, we look back and we think that we understood that that stuff was going to happen all along. So one example that they did to show hindsight bias and to make this kind of distinction between just, oh, we understand the past, and what hindsight bias is really saying, that we understand the past and we think our past future was actually very predictable, that a few weeks ago or a few months ago or a few years ago, we understood where we were heading and we were heading to where we are now, right? So here's an example. They do an experiment where they say, okay, what's the probability that the Detroit Lions will win their home opener in the next year's NFL season? They ask you this or whatever, and then they bring you back after that home opener, right? And they ask you the same question, but what they do is they say, okay, what was your prediction? What was the percentage chance that you put on the Detroit Lions winning their home opener? But now it's past the home opener. Now we've gone into the future, so to speak, right? We're into the future and we actually know, did the Detroit Lions win their home opener this year or not? And we're asked to say, okay, before the home opener, what was our probability that the Lions would win? Right? And so we could ask somebody and they could say, oh, well, you know, the Lions, they're okay this year. There's probably like a 40% chance that they'll win their home opener. And then the Lions play and the Lions win their home opener. And then we go to the second stage of the experiment and you're brought back in and you're asked the question, what did you put on the original experiment as the probability that the Lions would win their home opener? Well, it turns out that once I know that the Lions have won, I view my former self as having somewhat known that also, that I kind of knew what the future would be. So originally I put 40%. The Lions win, and I'm asked in the second round of the experiment, what did I put in the first round of the experiment? And my answer is usually something like 65%. Now that I know that the Lions have won, I think that I knew this all along. when it was the first round of the experiment, I knew the Lions were pretty likely to actually win that game, and we start telling stories about it. Well, it's a home opener. Even average teams play harder during their home opener. There's some hope, and the fans get behind them, and there's excitement and all these things, and we can start to kind of piece together why it was obvious that the Lions were going to win that game. Once we know the results, the way to them always seems a little bit more simple. We can see the reasons why what happened actually happened. And so then we say, oh, okay, well, all of that stuff is rather straightforward. An error is simply chalked up as an obvious error that was a fluke. Unfortunately, as Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. We think we understand where we are going. We think we know our destination. We think we know how to move forward because our backward-looking understanding makes us think the way forward is straight and narrow. If hindsight bias makes us see that our past was obvious and linear and more clear than it actually was, then wouldn't it make sense that our future would also look kind of obvious and clear and linear and straightforward? Hindsight bias messes with our understanding of where we're going by thinking and creating a world where we're at now was obvious in the past. There was an obvious path towards where we're at now. And so we think where we're heading in the future is also obvious.